The casserole was a weapon disguised as neighborly kindness. I carried it down the tidy cul-de-sac of Westbridge Heights, nodding at perfectly manicured lawns and the occasional wave from someone who clearly had nothing better to do than scrutinize my every move. The aluminum tray steamed under the afternoon sun, a modest offering of rosemary chicken and roasted vegetables, yet I could feel its weight in my hands like the subtle heft of leverage. People here love to talk, and I was about to become a story worth repeating. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. Emma spotted me first, leaning over her hydrangeas with the kind of vigilance usually reserved for border patrols. Her eyes lit up in that way that made it clear she had news to deliver. "Margaret, you'll never guess," she began, her voice taking on the sing-song quality of someone announcing a miracle or a disaster. I raised an eyebrow and smiled politely, the smile that had saved me from endless afternoons of gossip and book clubs and bridge games. "You'll have to guess then," I said, keeping the warmth just shy of invitation. "Oh, it's Richard," she said, barely containing her excitement. "He's been working late, again, and well, you know how people talk." I nodded, pretending to stir the casserole with an absent-minded motion. I know how people talk. They also forget what they had for breakfast 5 minutes ago. Emma frowned at the edges of my sarcasm. She never quite knew whether I was humoring her or exposing her. The truth was, I liked the uncertainty. It gave me a head start. "No, Margaret, listen. He's been seen. At a resort. With someone young." "Ah," I murmured, letting my lips curl into a thin line. The rumor mill in motion. How quaint. I took a small step closer, letting the casserole sway slightly, careful not to spill a drop. "And this someone young, do they play piano, paint, or just smile a lot?" Emma blinked. I don't know. But the photos... Margaret, the photos." She handed me her phone. I took it, keeping my expression neutral. The images were innocuous enough on their own. Richard laughing, arm casually draped around a woman whose hair gleamed like polished mahogany. Not a crime scene, not even particularly scandalous in isolation. But context was everything, and the context screamed more than the pictures ever could. I slipped the phone back into her hands with a faint, ironic smile. "Thank you, Emma. I'll keep this in mind. Rumor and truth are often at a dance together. Sometimes one steps on the other's toes." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're not mad?" I let the corners of my mouth twitch just slightly. Mad is a luxury I can't afford. Awareness, on the other hand. I let the sentence hang, letting the implication do its work. She nodded slowly, as if I had handed her a riddle she would need weeks to solve. By the time I returned home, I had already begun cataloging possibilities, as one does when betrayal is suspected but not yet confirmed. The cul-de-sac looked identical to itself, except for the slight shimmer of tension in the air, the way neighbors' eyes seemed to follow the misstep of a single leaf or stray blade of grass. Every greeting, every nod, every casual smile carried a hint of scrutiny that would have been exhausting if I hadn't learned long ago how to measure the world in subtleties. Richard's car wasn't in the driveway. That was hardly unusual, though now it carried a new weight. I set the casserole on the kitchen counter and opened my laptop, pulling up the cloud storage where our shared photos and messages resided. The digital world, unlike the cul-de-sac, left little room for interpretation once you knew what to look for. Scrolling through recent images, I stopped at one flagged by automatic tagging. A resort pool, a sun hat on a chaise, two indistinct figures. One of them, I suspected, had fingers too familiar, too careful, too comfortable with the other. My fingers hovered above the trackpad, not touching, as I let the recognition settle. This was the first tangible clue. Nothing in the world could change the way that tiny detail, the tilt of a wrist, the angle of a shoulder, spoke louder than any conversation. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of the discovery settle in its rightful place. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Quiet means planning. Every step from here needed to be precise, calculated, controlled, and I would take my time. Richard, for all his charm, would never see it coming. The next day, at the museum, I moved through the halls like a curator who had discovered a subtle but unmistakable flaw in a painting. The patrons admired artifacts, unaware that I observed patterns of human behavior with the same analytical eye. How easy it was, I thought, for someone to hide truth behind familiar lines. But just because something is hidden doesn't mean it's undetectable. I smiled inwardly at the thought. Observation is often more powerful than confrontation. I found myself returning to the resort images again, each time noting something new. A glance, a shadow, a fold in the fabric of a towel. The mind does not simply see, it interprets. An interpretation is a map, a plan, a framework for action. My emotions, I noted, were sharp but contained, edged with amusement more than anger. It is remarkable, I thought, how betrayal tastes different when you sip it slowly, examining each note instead of gulping it down. Lunch was a quiet affair. I met Jennifer at our usual cafe, a neutral territory where talk could flow without consequence. Jennifer's eyes widened as soon as I sat down. "I saw the photos," she said, almost in a whisper. "I didn't know if I should say anything." "See them, yes. Say anything, carefully," I replied, stirring my tea with deliberate slowness. There's a difference between reporting a sighting and confirming reality. One feeds gossip, the other strategy. Jennifer laughed softly, not entirely at ease. "You always were precise." "I learned from necessity," I said, letting the words hang with the weight of understatement. "Sometimes reality is best approached like a museum exhibit. Observe, catalog, plan your interpretation before anyone else can contest it." She frowned, clearly considering whether to ask more. I did not give her the chance. Some things are better shared in fragments. She nodded, reluctantly satisfied with the fragment I had offered. Returning home, I found myself pacing the living room, not in distress, but in measured calculation. The thought of Richard and his companion in that resort was less a source of raw pain and more a puzzle demanding a solution. Every human action has a ripple, and I had just begun tracing the subtle waves emanating from this one. The evening descended with ordinary quietness, the kind that blankets a neighborhood while whispering of secrets tucked behind closed doors. I poured a glass of wine, letting its mild bitterness punctuate my contemplation. My apartment smelled faintly of the rosemary from yesterday's casserole and the crisp, polished air of late afternoon. Everything was arranged, balanced, controlled. And yet beneath the surface, the gears of a larger design began to turn. Richard returned just as the light in the sky dimmed to amber, carrying his briefcase and an aura of unawareness. I greeted him with a smile that was both warm and cold at once, a smile that communicated that all was observed, all catalogued, all noted. He raised an eyebrow. "You seem chipper," he said, setting his briefcase down. "Observant as always," I replied lightly, swirling the wine in my glass. "It's a skill I cherish." He laughed, an easy, unthinking sound, and moved to the kitchen. I watched his movements with the precision of a curator evaluating a new acquisition. The familiarity of the domestic space now felt like a stage, and he was performing without knowing he was part of a drama more intricate than he imagined. Later, when he retreated to his study, I allowed myself a private smile. The first piece was in place, the first observation noted, the first ripple sent across the still surface of our lives. Quietly, I returned to my laptop. The resort image again, now examined with meticulous attention. I whispered to myself, not out of anger, but with a detached, almost clinical satisfaction. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Quiet means planning. Margaret Hale, curator of art and observer of human folly, was awake in ways she had never been before. The neighborhood might chatter, the lawns might gleam, and the streets might appear serene, but beneath the surface a quiet storm was assembling. I closed the laptop, took a slow sip of wine, and let the thought linger. The game had begun, and in Westbridge Heights no one would hear it coming. The photograph haunted me the way a subtle scent lingers in a room long after the source has been removed. It wasn't dramatic. No bright flashes, no shouting. Just Richard, laughing, arm resting comfortably around Claire Peterson, her smile effortless and radiant. The image spoke of intimacy, familiarity, and a casual disregard for the life I thought I had with him. I stared at it again in my museum office, letting each pixel settle into its own place in my mind. Observation, after all, was a kind of power. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, letting the faint hum of the air conditioner fill the silence. My office was quiet, sterile even, with polished wood and artifacts that had survived centuries of scrutiny. I liked that permanence. It reminded me that everything could be catalogued, preserved, interpreted. Unlike human relationships, which seemed fragile, unpredictable, and absurdly fragile in their complexity. Jennifer Collins was my next call. I hadn't needed to ask her to understand the severity of the photograph. She knew me too well. When she answered, her voice was hesitant, laced with that blend of caution and loyalty that made her indispensable. "I saw it," I said without preamble, letting the words fall like stones into still water. "The resort photo. Confirmed?" A pause. Then, confirmed. He was with her. "Margaret, I didn't want to say anything before, but yes. She's not just an acquaintance." I let a slow, deliberate breath escape. "Of course. I expected as much. That's why I called. Information is better than surprise. Jennifer was quiet on the line, and I appreciated it. People often feel the need to react. I rarely do. Reaction without planning is chaos masquerading as energy. I ended the call and leaned forward, opening my folder where copies of our shared documents and messages were stored. Among them, a single digital copy of Richard's father's will caught my eye. Thomas Hale had been meticulous, a man who understood the weight of precision in both art and life. The clause I held in my hand, or rather my screen, was subtle, nearly invisible to someone unobservant, but I had memorized it the way one memorizes a painting's brushstrokes. The inheritance was conditional, structured like an elaborate puzzle that only the attentive could navigate. I smiled faintly, not from satisfaction, but from recognition. This wasn't about revenge yet. This was about preparation. Quiet planning. Everything else would follow. Later that evening, I took a walk through the streets near the museum, letting my thoughts drift in measured currents. The neighborhood was quiet in that golden hour between work and dinner. Children's laughter from distant yards, sprinklers casting tiny rainbows, the low hum of air conditioning units. It all blended into the perfect mask for subtle strategies unfolding unseen. I liked the idea that while everyone else saw ordinary routine, I saw patterns. Human patterns. The patterns that could be nudged, manipulated, and ultimately redirected. I thought about Claire. Young, confident, perhaps clever in her own way, but unaware of the depth of calculation she had stumbled into. Her mistake wasn't her ambition. It was underestimating the observant, the quietly prepared. People like her assumed that subtlety was weakness, that patience was absence of action. How delightful it would be to correct that assumption. Back at home, I went through the messages once more, letting each one sink in. There were little things in their exchanges, timing, word choice, casual references, that revealed more than face-to-face encounters ever could. The way she called him Richard in moments that should have been public but were private. The way he responded with a familiarity that bordered on overconfidence. Each digital breadcrumb laid a path that, if followed carefully, led to a reveal that would be undeniable, precise, devastating, without excess. I paused at the memory of my late father-in-law, Thomas Hale, as he had once explained, with a kind of quiet authority that still echoed. Control is nothing without structure. Strategy is meaningless without patience. I had held on to that advice, tucked it away like a priceless object, and now it applied perfectly. The will clause was a tool, a piece of leverage that required neither confrontation nor spectacle to wield. Its power lay in the knowledge of it and the timing of its revelation. I drafted a note to myself, careful to word it in the tone of a curator cataloging an exhibit. Observe, confirm, wait, execute. Simple, elegant, unmovable. Each step precise, each moment measured. The photograph had shifted me from observer to strategist. There was no need for dramatic gestures. This was a chess game, and every piece mattered. I thought about the divorce papers. Quietly, I signed them earlier in the week. A formality, yes, but more importantly, a marker. Not of defeat, but of transition. Legal detachment provides clarity. Emotional detachment allows planning. By the time Richard realized the significance, it would be too late. Not that he would think in these terms. His confidence was his blind spot, one I intended to exploit fully. Late that night, I reviewed my mental map of their routines. Claire's visits, Richard's late nights, the subtle network of friends and acquaintances who functioned as eyes and ears. The observation points were in place. Every predictable move, every casual social gathering, every shared laugh, they were now part of a larger design. This was not about confrontation yet. It was about preparation, the slow construction of leverage that would guarantee precision when deployed. I allowed myself a quiet amusement as I imagined Claire's reaction when she eventually understood the depth of awareness she had provoked. Confidence, as it turns out, is often brittle when confronted with calm calculation. It breaks without noise, leaving only the careful observer to rearrange the pieces. Sleep was deliberate, not hurried. I woke at first light, not to confront, but to continue the quiet accumulation of knowledge. A mind well fed with observation is a mind armed with clarity. I spent the morning tracing social networks in my head, considering the subtle flows of information in Westbridge Heights. Each neighbor, each casual conversation, each innocuous comment could serve as a channel, a lever, a catalyst. By mid-morning, I was drafting small, innocuous communications, the kind that seemed mundane but carried hidden utility. A compliment here, a casual remark there, each designed to observe reactions, to measure responses, to note inconsistencies. Patterns revealed themselves quickly to a patient eye. Even the smallest deviation was a thread to follow, a clue to how the larger picture might be manipulated. Jennifer called again, tentatively offering to share minor observations from the neighborhood, a kind of intelligence network disguised as friendship. I accepted, careful to keep the exchanges brief, coded in subtle cues. She was a reliable source, not because she was clever, but because she could be guided to report exactly what I needed to know. Information is power only when it is curated. By afternoon, I returned to the digital archive, examining messages and photos in fine detail. Each casual interaction between Richard and Claire revealed more about habits, routines, and assumptions. There was a rhythm to them, a comfort that spoke of underestimation. People rarely realize how transparent they become when they assume nothing will challenge their narrative. My observations were accumulating like the layers of paint on an ancient canvas, each layer revealing depth previously unseen. As evening approached, I walked again, this time deliberately passing the cafes, boutiques, and yoga studios where our neighbors convened. From a distance, I observed Claire as she moved through her social orbit, smiling, confident, and entirely unaware. This was the art of planning. Seeing without being seen, noting without being noticed. Every gesture, every glance, every subtle interaction became a data point, a piece of the eventual mosaic. Returning home, I allowed myself a final moment of reflection. The photograph was no longer just a spark. It had ignited a process. I wasn't reacting with anger or despair. I was planning with precision. The inheritance clause, the careful observation, the quietly collected information, all of it would converge at the right moment. I poured a second glass of wine, letting the subtle warmth fill my hands, my thoughts, my awareness. Margaret Hale, once quietly patient, now quietly strategic, was awake to possibilities she had ignored for far too long. The photograph had shifted everything. It was no longer about what had been done. It was about what could be executed with precision, patience, and unwavering calm. I whispered to myself, with a faint smirk, "He wanted space. I'll give him all the space money can't buy." The night settled over Westbridge Heights, ordinary in appearance, yet charged with the undercurrent of carefully measured strategy. Observation had become action, planning had become purpose, and the quiet, persistent ripple that began with a single photograph was already spreading, unnoticed by everyone except me. Coffee shops have a way of revealing people without their consent. Steam from lattes, the faint hum of conversation, the way a hand trembles slightly when reaching for sugar. Each detail carries more than surface significance. I sat at my usual corner table, notebook open but untouched, letting my eyes roam, cataloging interactions with the calm curiosity of a museum curator observing a fragile artifact. Claire had appeared at one across town yesterday, chatting easily with a small group of women who laughed a little too loudly at her jokes. Confidence, charm, obliviousness. I made a mental note. Jennifer sat across from me, stirring her drink with a kind of hesitancy that made it clear she was measuring her own reactions to me. "She's integrating well," Jennifer said carefully. "Yes," I replied, eyes still on the group at the far end of the cafe. "Integration is a delicate dance. Some people do it gracefully. Others step on toes without realizing." I let the words hang between us like a gentle warning. She nodded, biting her lip. Outside, the HOA president strolled by, clipboard in hand, waving at familiar faces. It was the kind of superficial civility that masks tension, perfect for observation, perfect for testing how information moves through social networks. I had already begun the subtle art of planting curiosity. A comment here, an almost noticed gesture there, each designed to shift attention without seeming intrusive. Gossip, after all, is only dangerous when it is carefully curated. The real work began at the yoga studio. Claire had taken to a class that was usually quiet, a sanctuary of stretching limbs and meditative breaths. Today, she arrived, mat in hand, unaware that her habitual punctuality and slightly self-assured stance were being catalogued in detail by someone who noticed patterns. I kept a low profile near the back, nodding occasionally to the instructor, all the while watching, noting, and filing away impressions. Claire's ease was almost tangible. She laughed at a joke made by the instructor, adjusted her hair with a flick of the wrist, and subtly corrected a pose for someone nearby. Influence. Small authority exercised unconsciously. I allowed myself a thin smile. Such habits, when understood, could be useful. Influence can be redirected, manipulated, and used to shape perception. Later, at the HOA meeting, the real game of observation and subtle manipulation unfolded. I sat near the back, hands folded over my notebook, pretending to doodle, while ears and eyes absorbed information. Richard's sister, Evelyn, spoke at length about neighborhood improvements, sprinklers, flower beds, and property values, her voice a mixture of entitlement and rehearsed charm. Two of Richard's former friends nodded along, clearly aligning themselves with her authority. Small moves, predictable reactions, all feeding the larger pattern. I raised my hand at a moment when it seemed innocuous, asking a question about landscaping schedules, but with phrasing designed to expose a subtle inconsistency in the HOA minutes. The room paused. Evelyn's smile faltered slightly, just long enough for me to notice. A minor victory, perhaps, but evidence that attentiveness yields advantage. By evening, I had traced the day's interactions into a mental map of social currents. Claire was becoming a hub, Richard's allies were predictable in their arrogance, and the neighborhood's gossip channels were active and malleable. The pieces were in place for future nudges, subtle suggestions that would seed uncertainty and curiosity without revealing the observer. The first real action of the day came unexpectedly. Richard's new office had a large window that caught sunlight in a way that reflected across the street. While retrieving an innocuous document from my own records, I noticed a pattern in the blinds, a slight irregularity that suggested something worth observing. Curiosity led me closer, and the office door, left just slightly ajar, invited attention. I stepped in, careful to keep my movements casual. Inside, the room smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, a scent I associated with authority and complacency. I allowed my gaze to scan the desk, noting the arrangement of files, the placement of personal photographs, and the subtle clutter that marked a lack of meticulous oversight. My presence went unnoticed. A small thrill ran through me, not of excitement, but of clarity. Observation without discovery is the purest form of advantage. A knock on the door jolted me, subtle but enough to remind me that even the best-laid observation requires caution. I retreated smoothly, a graceful exit that left nothing disturbed, nothing altered, but the insight remained. Patterns confirmed. Routine predictable. Advantage secured. Back on the street, I paused to consider the evening's discoveries. Each small action, each careful observation had built a layer of understanding. Knowledge, after all, is leverage. And leverage is far more effective when the other party believes themselves unobserved. A message popped up on my phone, anonymous and brief. Engagement party. Claire and Richard. Invitation forthcoming. I let the note sit, unsent in thought, as if its significance required my quiet consideration. I knew what it meant. The next phase of observation would become social theater, a stage where influence and subtle maneuvering could yield direct consequences. The invitation was an opportunity, a controlled environment to apply pressure, to seed uncertainty, to shift perception. I spent the night mapping possibilities, what to observe, whom to speak to, which comments would ripple effectively without detection. It was a dance of timing and perception, each move premeditated, each outcome anticipated. The photograph and the subtle data I had gathered over the previous days provided context, but the social environment offered execution. Strategy was now ready to meet stagecraft. By morning, I had refined my plan into several layers. The public face, polite, engaged, interested in community and social norms. The private mind, aware, calculating, quietly adaptive. Claire's confidence could be tested, Richard's predictability exploited, and the network of acquaintances leveraged to create subtle tension. Timing, precision, and calm observation would turn ordinary interactions into influence, and influence into advantage. The next day, at a local cafe, I watched Claire again, this time observing how she handled casual interactions with new arrivals. A slight smile, a carefully measured compliment, the way she tilted her head to listen, influence in motion. I noted her tendency to dominate brief conversations with charm, unaware that each habit could be leveraged, redirected, or exposed. Jennifer joined me for debriefing, providing additional observations from her own encounters. Each snippet of information added a brushstroke to the larger portrait I was assembling. Every detail mattered. Who laughed, who looked away, who lingered too long in conversation. Patterns, always patterns. By afternoon, I had begun planting subtle hints in casual remarks, gauging reactions with care. A passing comment about a misplaced envelope, a minor reference to Richard's schedule, all designed to create small ripples of curiosity without seeming deliberate. People reveal themselves when they think the observer is inattentive. That was the principle I followed with religious precision. Later, a minor act of observation provided unexpected insight. I caught sight of Claire fumbling briefly with her phone, an expression of frustration passing quickly across her face before her practiced smile returned. Such slips are rare, but they exist. The smallest moments of vulnerability reveal patterns, and patterns create leverage. I cataloged it mentally, knowing it would be useful later. By evening, I returned home, satisfied with the day's results. Information had been gathered, patterns confirmed, influence seeded. The neighborhood remained oblivious to the subtle chess game unfolding beneath their attention. The photograph, the resort, the casual social encounters, all were part of a growing network of knowledge, and knowledge is preparation. Sitting in the quiet of my apartment, I allowed myself a brief smile. Observation, planning, influence, the trifecta of controlled action. Claire would continue to move with confidence, Richard with arrogance, unaware that each habit, each predictable move, each casual choice was now catalogued, measured, and ready to be exploited. I closed my notebook and poured a glass of wine, not in indulgence, but in ritual. Margaret Hale, observer and strategist, was awake in every sense. The neighborhood, the social circles, the predictable routines, all of it was now a controlled environment, and the game, subtle and quiet, had truly begun. Tomorrow would bring another layer, another observation, another subtle act to shape perception. In Westbridge Heights, appearances mattered more than truth, and I intended to bend appearances with precision. Jennifer's earlier words echoed in my mind. She's integrating well. Yes, she was. But integration without awareness is vulnerability, and vulnerability is, quietly, power, waiting to be claimed. The night settled in, the streets calm, the lamps casting warm circles of light on the sidewalks. Everything appeared ordinary. Yet beneath that calm, the pattern was taking shape, observation feeding strategy, strategy feeding preparation. And when the moment came, the carefully constructed web of influence and knowledge would converge, precise and inescapable. I poured a final note to myself in the mental ledger of the day. Observe. Influence. Wait. Patience. Quiet planning was now action. The social game had begun. And in Westbridge Heights, not a single participant suspected the subtle pressure already building around them. The night had a peculiar quality, one that seemed to stretch time without bending it, as if the streets themselves had agreed to hold their breath while I moved through them. Westbridge Heights, usually a place of carefully maintained appearances and polite glances, carried an unexpected weight in the darkness. Shadows stretched long under the street lamps, flickering over hedges and trimmed lawns. The quiet hum of distant traffic offered a soundtrack to anticipation rather than intrusion. My car glided along the familiar roads with deliberate slowness, tires rolling like whispers over the asphalt. I had chosen tonight because the neighborhood's rhythms were predictable. Claire's patterns were carefully mapped. Yoga class, coffee at the corner cafe, dinner with acquaintances she considered safe. Predictable behavior is an asset in observation, and knowledge of these behaviors offered leverage. Timing was everything. I had no need to rush. Each step, each pause, each glance counted. Claire's townhouse emerged from the shadows like a model in a staged photograph. The lights were muted, the balcony doors closed except for the faint glow from inside, revealing her silhouette against the drapes. She believed she was unseen, that her movements were private. That belief was a mistake. I parked several houses away, far enough to appear incidental, yet close enough for a clear view. The engine idled softly, a quiet companion as I reviewed her habits once more in my mind. Observation is not merely watching, it is cataloging, predicting, and mentally rehearsing. I traced her likely movements, noting every glance, every posture, every habitual gesture I had observed over the past weeks. When she appeared on the balcony, phone in hand, it was with the casual confidence of someone entirely secure in her world. I watched the tilt of her head, the rhythm of her fingers over the screen, the slight tension in her shoulders. Even confidence can falter under subtle pressure, and I intended to apply it carefully. Stepping out of the car, I moved deliberately toward her townhouse, a measured rhythm in my heels that conveyed presence without menace. The soft crunch of gravel underfoot was deliberate, a punctuation in the otherwise silent night. I made no attempt to mask my approach entirely. I wanted her to sense awareness, to perceive that she was being noted without understanding to what extent. "Lovely night," I said casually as I neared the entrance, voice carrying over the soft hum of the air. Claire started slightly, instinctively turning toward the sound, then masking her reaction with a polite, controlled smile. "Margaret? I didn't expect—" "Neither did I replied lightly, letting the words hang with a subtle ambiguity. Not surprise, not threat, just presence. My gaze drifted toward her parked car, then back to her face, noting the almost imperceptible tightening at the corners of her eyes. A flicker of recognition, unease brushing the edges of her composure. We spoke briefly, words light and superficial, yet each nuance mattered. Every inflection, every hesitation, every carefully masked reaction was catalogued, a small clue in the larger pattern. She laughed politely at something trivial, and I allowed a faint, private smile to touch my lips. Panic, even minor and internal, is far more revealing than overt expressions. I moved closer to her car, letting my hand trace the surface with the lightest touch. This was not an act of aggression. It was a mark, deliberate and symbolic, like leaving a signature on a carefully restored piece of art. A subtle message. Observation is constant, awareness precise. You know, I said casually, leaning lightly against the hood, some things are clearer when seen in detail. Her eyes flicked toward mine, that brief spark of unease betraying her otherwise flawless composure. I allowed it to register fully before stepping back. Curiosity is an interesting trait. Sometimes it's rewarded, sometimes it's noted. Claire's lips pressed together, tension flickering across her features for a fraction of a second before her polite mask returned. I let the moment linger. Subtle disruption is often more effective than confrontation, and tonight, influence was more important than noise. As I retreated to my car, I cataloged every detail, the shift in her posture, the tightness in her hands, the slight hesitation in her voice. Observation alone can unbalance even the most confident, and the knowledge that someone sees, someone notes, someone anticipates. That is leverage in its purest form. Back on the road, I drove slowly, allowing time for reflection. Patterns confirmed, behaviors predicted, advantage secured. Each previous observation, the photograph, the digital trail, her social habits, aligned with tonight's assessment. Patience and timing had transformed suspicion into preparation, preparation into quiet action. The next day, the ordinary rhythms of Westbridge Heights served as a mask for subtle strategy. I began cataloging her social interactions in more detail, noting minor gestures, fleeting expressions, and inadvertent cues that revealed discomfort or surprise. Confidence is fragile when it encounters consistent, precise awareness. Every detail I recorded reinforced a growing network of influence, one that could be applied when the time and stage were appropriate. Lunch was a deliberate affair at the corner cafe where Claire often went. I positioned myself to observe without drawing attention, noting how she interacted with friends, how she smiled, how she managed conversation. Each movement, each pattern, each habitual gesture was data. Influence is a product of observation, and data, carefully interpreted, becomes leverage. Jennifer joined me mid-afternoon, and together we mapped minor social interventions. Casual remarks, well-timed questions, hints of misplaced items. Each small act could create ripples that, once observed, would alter perception without direct confrontation. Jennifer marveled at my calm, as if every move were already predetermined, every reaction anticipated. I smiled faintly. In strategy, anticipation is everything. Later, I returned to the townhouse, this time on foot, moving quietly through the streets. The night air carried distant sounds, traffic, a dog barking, the hum of air conditioning, but these noises only sharpened my focus. Claire's car was parked outside as expected. Lights were low, windows dimly glowing. She moved inside with a sense of casual assurance, unaware that each gesture had been catalogued in detail over weeks of observation. I allowed myself to pause, watching from a distance. Observation is a tool, and mastery of it requires patience. I catalogued everything, how she held her phone, the rhythm of her steps, the casual swing of her arms. Each small habit revealed more than she intended, offering insight into vulnerabilities that subtle influence could exploit. By midnight, I had constructed a mental map of the townhouse, the surrounding streets, and likely patterns of movement. Observation alone was insufficient. Influence required careful placement of cues, subtle disruption of expected routines, and precise timing. Each potential ripple was considered, every reaction anticipated. I was preparing a stage where perception, carefully guided, would yield advantage without spectacle. The first minor act of physical influence came quietly. I approached the car again, deliberately, tracing a subtle mark along the surface that would be noticeable only to a discerning eye. Not destruction, not aggression, but a message of awareness. A signature of observation, applied with precision. The moment was brief, invisible to anyone but the observer, and yet it carried weight. Claire appeared on the balcony, phone in hand, unaware of the subtle disruption. I allowed her to see me for a moment, then withdrew to the shadows, leaving ambiguity in place of clarity. Awareness can be destabilizing even without confrontation, and the effect was immediate. She adjusted her posture, fingers brushing the railing with a faint hesitation. Every slight shift mattered, every tiny reaction catalogued. Returning to my car, I allowed a slow smile to form. Patterns confirmed, influence applied, anticipation maintained. Control, subtle and deliberate, was far more effective than noise or spectacle. Timing remained critical. Every act of observation was a preparation for the eventual demonstration of consequence. The following days were a continuation of the careful orchestration. Social observation, minor interventions, subtle manipulations, all designed to cultivate tension, awareness, and influence. Conversations at the cafe, gestures at yoga, casual remarks in passing, all became instruments in a quiet, deliberate symphony. I noted Claire's small missteps, her moments of hesitation, the way she occasionally glanced toward familiar streets as if sensing observation. Confidence, when confronted with consistent awareness, falters quietly, imperceptibly, but unmistakably. Advantage grows in those moments, invisible to the unobservant. Each evening, I reviewed my observations, cataloged behaviors, and refined my strategy. The mental map of Claire's routines expanded. The social network of Westbridge Heights became increasingly navigable, and the timing for the engagement party's stage grew precise. Patience remained central. The smallest misstep could undermine subtlety, and subtlety was essential. The night before the planned engagement, I walked once more through the familiar streets, observing windows, balconies, and streetlights. Patterns confirmed, behaviors predicted, minor adjustments noted. Influence is strongest when the target believes themselves unseen. Tonight, I ensured that every line of sight, every potential interruption, and every environmental detail was aligned with the observation I had meticulously constructed. I paused near a quiet intersection, noting a street lamp's angle, the sway of tree branches, and the distant movement of cars. Even in ordinary suburban life, small details create opportunities. A light flicker, a shadow, a misplaced object. Each can be leveraged in subtle ways to reinforce presence and control. By the time I returned home, the evening had solidified my mental plan. Observation, influence, anticipation, all converged toward the engagement party. Claire's confidence, Richard's arrogance, and the neighborhood's social patterns were now mapped in full. Each ripple, each subtle cue, each carefully applied measure of awareness would converge into effect at precisely the right moment. I allowed myself a quiet smile. Margaret Hale, patient, precise, and deliberate, had constructed the stage, applied subtle influence, and prepared the environment for maximum impact. Timing, patience, and awareness were complete. As I poured a final glass of wine, I whispered to myself, "The stage is ready. All else is timing." The ballroom at the Hale estate gleamed like polished glass under the warm glow of chandeliers, each crystal refracting light into tiny fragments that danced across the marble floor. The air smelled faintly of roses and expensive cologne, a delicate combination meant to impress and disarm. I stepped inside, deliberately understated, in a dress that whispered elegance without demanding attention. Observation first, spectacle later. It was a principle I had long adhered to. The room was a study in social architecture. Investors and relatives, acquaintances and casual neighbors, all gathered under the illusion of celebration, unaware that every movement, every glance, every carefully timed laugh was being catalogued. The party had been constructed for charm and performance, but I intended to make it a stage for subtle revelation. Claire floated through the room, radiant, poised, utterly confident in her place among the crowd. Richard was nearby, smiling easily, unaware that every habit, every predictable gesture had been carefully recorded. I moved slowly along the perimeter, allowing my eyes to catch details others would miss. The slight tension in Claire's fingers as she held a flute of champagne, the brief shift in Richard's posture when a familiar investor approached, the patterns of laughter and deference that defined this world. I paused near the refreshment table, letting my presence seem casual. A compliment here, a nod there, tiny calibrations designed to observe reactions without revealing intent. Influence works best when unnoticed, and tonight, observation was the true power at play. The envelope waited discreetly in my clutch, unremarkable, yet carrying significance. Its contents were a culmination of planning, observation, and quiet strategy, a simple clause that, once revealed, would recalibrate the balance of power in the room. Timing was everything, and the moment had not yet arrived. Patience, as always, was essential. I allowed Claire and Richard to circulate, each interaction reinforcing the patterns I had anticipated. A subtle misplacement of a glass, a comment misremembered, a fleeting hesitation, all catalogued. Advantage was not about force. It was about understanding and applying knowledge with precision. By mid-evening, the energy of the room had begun to shift, imperceptibly at first. Small ripples of curiosity, subtle glances exchanged across tables, faint murmurs that carried just enough uncertainty to be noticed by an attentive observer. I smiled inwardly. Patterns confirmed. Timing perfect. Execution imminent. I approached Claire casually as she laughed at a remark made by one of the guests, a small tilt of her head betraying a flicker of doubt. "May I speak with you for a moment?" I asked lightly, voice conversational. Her smile faltered just enough to register awareness, but she complied, curiosity and subtle apprehension written across her features. We stepped aside near a quiet alcove, the soft murmur of the crowd providing background noise. I handed her the envelope with the ease of someone delivering a simple note. She took it, fingers brushing briefly against mine, unaware that the touch carried no threat, only the weight of observation and consequence. She hesitated, then opened it, scanning the contents with rapid, sharp movements of her eyes. The will clause, written in precise legal language, commanded attention not through volume but through implications. I watched her carefully, noting the subtle widening of her eyes, the brief pause as comprehension settled in. "Oh," she whispered, almost inaudibly, then read aloud, each word sounding like a revelation to the room, despite the casual cadence of her voice. "Richard's inheritance is conditional, and if not met—" She trailed off, the realization dawning in real time. The effect was immediate. Richard's smile faltered as he approached, catching the end of her reading. Confusion, followed by sudden comprehension, crossed his features. The room, previously a tableau of controlled social performance, shifted subtly. Murmurs rippled outward, a current of tension threading through the guests as investors and relatives began to piece together the implications. I remained calm, composed, as though observing a minor exhibit, my heels clicking softly against the marble floor, a metronome marking the passage of consequence. Richard approached, attempting to reassert control, but the subtle fractures in perception had already taken hold. Each question, each demand, each attempt at charm was met with hesitation, a delicate disruption of authority. Claire's face registered panic, brief but unmistakable. The ease with which she had maneuvered the social space evaporated, replaced by uncertainty and awareness of her own miscalculation. Influence, once subtle, had shifted into clarity. Advantage, once latent, was now realized. I allowed a moment to pass, letting the room absorb the revelation. Every subtle gesture, every glimmer of doubt, every misalignment of perception was a ripple in a pond carefully prepared. The crowd's attention shifted naturally toward the implications, toward the structural imbalance now apparent in the room. Richard's attempts to reclaim composure were visible, though imperfect. He moved among the guests with a practiced charm, smiling where he would normally dominate, nodding where he would normally command. But the patterns I had anticipated held true. Subtle, precise observation had translated into quiet influence, now manifest in the social response around him. I moved toward the exit, each step deliberate, a silent punctuation marking the culmination of patient preparation. The envelope, now empty of purpose but full of effect, had done its work. Guests whispered, investors exchanged glances, and Richard's presence, once commanding, felt suddenly diminished. I smiled faintly, allowing the calm of control to settle in its rightful place. Outside, the night air carried a subtle satisfaction. The street lamps cast familiar circles of light across the sidewalk, ordinary in appearance, yet now charged with the undercurrent of influence set in motion inside. I allowed myself a final glance back at the estate, heels clicking softly, a metronome marking the quiet but undeniable shift in balance. Richard's voice called after me, sharp and surprised, but I did not turn. The patterns had been established, the influence delivered, and the precision of timing maintained, calm, collected, and deliberate. I had orchestrated the ripple and let it flow, letting observation and subtle manipulation achieve the result without spectacle or excess. The night remained serene, Westbridge Heights unaware of the quiet strategy that had unfolded among chandeliers and whispered realizations. Influence had been applied, advantage secured, and the social game shifted irreversibly. I walked away, each step deliberate, each breath measured, allowing the consequences to settle naturally without intervention. The photograph, the messages, the careful observations, and the quiet acts of influence had culminated in this moment. Clarity and precision, patience and planning had brought the game to a controlled apex. Margaret Hale, always observant, always precise, moved into the night with the calm satisfaction of someone who had turned knowledge into influence, strategy into effect, and quiet patience into tangible consequence. The engagement party, once a stage of performance, had become a canvas for subtle recalibration. Advantage had shifted, patterns had broken, and the quiet observer had emerged fully prepared for what came next. The mansion was quiet, but not empty. The walls themselves seemed to hold the echo of consequences, their polished surfaces reflecting faint, distorted images of absence and miscalculation. The faint hum of the air conditioning, the subtle creak of floorboards, even the way light fell across the hallway, it all carried meaning. I walked through the central gallery with deliberate steps, heels clicking softly against marble, cataloging every shadow, every artifact, every small detail of the space I had once shared with him. The past lingered here, like a carefully preserved exhibit, but tonight it would bear witness to the shift I had orchestrated. I knew he would come. Richard always came when patterns shifted against him, when control slipped from his grasp. Timing was his weakness. He could never resist testing boundaries, seeking to reclaim dominance where he assumed he had authority. That assumption would fail spectacularly tonight. He appeared first in the faint light spilling from the upper foyer, his silhouette framed by the shadows of the chandelier. The practiced ease of his smile had vanished, replaced by a taut, measured tension. Every line of his body betrayed calculation, effort to maintain composure in a space where he no longer held the upper hand. "Margaret," he said, voice tight, almost brittle. "We need to talk." I allowed myself a small pause before turning, letting the sound of his approach fill the space between us. Observation first, confrontation second. "We already are," I replied evenly, stepping into view with careful poise. "Just not in the way you expect." His eyes scanned the room, lingering on the subtle signs of the previous night. The faint traces of celebration, the displaced furniture, the soft hum of life continuing in absence. "You've changed things," he said, the words almost a question, almost a plea. I tilted my head lightly, a gesture that was both casual and precise. "Not changed," I said softly. "Clarified. Patterns simply revealed themselves." He took a cautious step closer, testing the space between us. Every motion was predictable, catalogued in advance. Observation had taught me his rhythms, anticipation had taught me his weaknesses. I allowed a moment of silence to hang between us, letting him register that control had shifted. "You've humiliated me," he said finally, voice taut with frustration. "In front of everyone." I smiled faintly, letting the calm of precision do the work words could not. "Humiliation is a matter of perspective," I said evenly. "I prefer clarity and accuracy. The rest is perception." He exhaled sharply, a controlled sound that carried both exasperation and disbelief. "Why are you doing this?" "Because awareness is more powerful than assumption," I said softly, stepping forward, deliberate and measured. "Control is more durable than arrogance. You relied on both, and they failed." Richard's hands flexed slightly at his sides, tension rippling through his posture. I catalogued every small shift, every micro-expression, the twitch of a jaw, the narrowing of eyes, the almost imperceptible step backward. Confrontation is as much about patience as it is presence. Advantage lies in precision. "Why won't you give me any relief?" he asked, voice low now, cautious, almost pleading. I let silence stretch, giving weight to the words he had spoken. "Relief is a privilege, not an obligation." "Because restoration requires acknowledgement," I said finally. "Acknowledgement is a choice, not an entitlement." The tension was thick, almost tangible, the air itself seeming to respond to the energy between us. Richard's movements were measured but hesitant. Every action, every step, betrayed awareness that he no longer fully controlled the space. That awareness is influence, silent, yet profoundly effective. I moved toward the central foyer, my hand lightly resting on the polished console. The sprinkler system, subtle and controlled, had been set to operate with minimal disruption. One twist of the dial, one small adjustment, and a soft hissing filled the room, mist curling along the floor, reflecting the light of the chandelier. The effect on Richard was immediate. He glanced toward the car, his prized classic parked under the portico, now misted in a delicate, deliberate pattern that dulled its otherwise immaculate finish, symbolic, precise, and unmistakably deliberate. His breath caught slightly at the sight, and I allowed myself a faint, private smile. Observation, preparation, and timing had produced effect without aggression, without spectacle. Influence, subtle and quiet, had shifted the balance. "You've destroyed everything," he said, voice tight. His eyes flicked to the car, then back to me, struggling to reconcile authority with loss. I stepped closer, deliberately calm, allowing the mist from the sprinklers to curl around my ankles, emphasizing presence without threat. "Not destroyed," I said softly, letting the words resonate with precision. "Adjusted, clarified, patterns revealed themselves." He exhaled again, more sharply this time, pacing slightly as he measured the extent of his miscalculation. Every step, every gesture, every tight jaw was catalogued. Confrontation, in this form, is psychological. Precision replaces spectacle, and anticipation replaces brute force. "You've left me nothing," he said finally, voice low, careful. "No path forward, no reprieve." I allowed a slow, measured pause, letting the air carry the weight of observation. "Because patterns, once recognized, demand acknowledgement," I said, voice calm but firm. "And acknowledgement is earned, not demanded." He shifted slightly, tension radiating from him in small pulses. each observed and recorded. The mansion, once a stage of his performance, had become a silent witness to his miscalculations. Influence, applied with precision, had altered the perception of control. Authority, once assumed, had been quietly undermined. I allowed my gaze to drift toward the classic car again, noting the subtle disruption in its pristine finish. A symbolic act, nonviolent, yet unmistakable in its implications. The tangible evidence of recalibrated balance, delivered without spectacle, but observed fully by the intended recipient. Richard's hands flexed again, subtle but telling. Every micro-movement, every reaction confirmed the shift in power. Subtle influence, quietly applied, had taken hold. Advantage remained mine. I moved to the central gallery, heels clicking softly, a rhythm of deliberate certainty. Each footfall, each measured movement, reinforced the awareness that control had shifted. He followed cautiously, stepping lightly, attempting to maintain composure while recognizing the subtle recalibration of authority. "Why are you so precise?" he asked finally, almost incredulously. "Why not act more overtly?" I allowed myself a faint smile. "Overt action invites resistance," I said softly. "Subtlety creates clarity. Influence without noise is far more durable than any display of force. You've discovered this now, but it is a lesson best learned through observation." He shifted again, glancing at the hallway, the walls, the faint evidence of past gatherings, the lingering aroma of roses and polished wood. The mansion had become a canvas for subtle consequence. Observation translated into effect, anticipation translated into leverage. Every corner, every reflection, every faint echo of footsteps served as a reminder of influence applied with precision. I stepped closer, deliberately calm. Patterns, once revealed, cannot be ignored. Influence, once applied subtly, reshapes perception quietly but irreversibly. An advantage, once secured, is maintained through patience and observation, not spectacle. Richard's response was almost imperceptible. A slight pause, a breath held, the tightening of his shoulders. He understood, even if unwilling to admit it fully. Observation had become execution. Patience had become consequence. I allowed a moment of silence to stretch, letting him internalize the quiet power of precision. Every movement, every adjustment, every deliberate placement of influence over the past weeks had converged here. The mansion, the car, the social structures, the patterns, all aligned with subtle, deliberate effect. I moved toward the threshold, soft light from the hallway casting deliberate shadows. "Restoration complete," I said finally, voice calm, deliberate, unshaken. Richard's expression flickered between frustration and reluctant comprehension. No words of reconciliation, no pleas for reprieve, no offers of negotiation would change the precision of the outcome. Influence, carefully applied, had reached its culmination. I walked away, heels clicking softly on marble, leaving him and the mansion behind. Outside, the night air was cool, ordinary, carrying the faint scent of mist and polished wood. Westbridge Heights slept, oblivious to the subtle recalibration of authority that had occurred within the walls. Every ripple I had orchestrated over weeks, observation, influence, anticipation, had converged into effect. The mansion receded behind me, its quiet grandeur now a witness to subtle consequence. Richard's remaining authority, once assumed and absolute, had been reshaped with precision and patience. The patterns had been disrupted, the influence applied, the equilibrium restored, but not to what had been lost, only to clarity achieved through deliberate action. I allowed a final breath, slow and deliberate, marking the end of the sequence. No triumph was necessary, no celebration was required. Quiet observation, careful preparation, and subtle execution had achieved result. Patterns revealed, influence applied, advantage maintained. Margaret Hale, observer, strategist, quietly assertive, walked into the night with the satisfaction of a mission executed with precision. No spectacle, no drama, just clarity, consequence, and the unshakable control that comes from awareness applied deliberately over time. The night remained calm, ordinary, unsuspecting. Yet beneath the surface, Westbridge Heights would never again be the same. One observer had acted with patience, precision, and deliberate calculation, and the effects, subtle but undeniable, would persist beyond immediate perception. I moved away, leaving behind the mansion, the misted car, the echoes of subtle consequence. The sequence was complete. Observation had become influence, preparation had become execution, patience had become resolution. And I, quietly, deliberately, walked into the calm of night, fully aware of the enduring power of quiet, careful strategy.